Thank you. Hi, I'm David. I'm an addict.
Hi, David.
And I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to the committee and to God and to NA and to you all. Thank you for showing up. You know that you can tell that you're in an NA convention. Strangers are giving each other hugs even in the bathrooms and in the elevators. Second, everybody on the staff is happy to see us except for the bartenders. And third, there's something a little bit cracked about us. Our gang, we're law-abiding and we're fun-loving, but we're a little weird. I don't know if you've noticed. And people find us talking recovery everywhere, even doing comedy bits with each other. At one convention, I saw 3 addicts abreast walking down the hallway going, "Jails, institutions, and death. Oh my, jails, Well, in NA, we share hugs. Is there anybody here who's had too many hugs this weekend? I see no hands, so please do me a favor and give your neighbor a hug. Take a second. Just a few seconds now. What have I started? Thanks, they wanted me to get a hug too. Addicts don't listen to suggestions. Some of them are getting phone numbers too. Okay, shh. Can we have another moment of silence to remember why we're here and who brought us here? Thanks, everybody, and thank you for putting the emphasis on we rather than just on me, because I need the help. Out there somewhere, there's an addict in the crowd who decided the moment he saw me, or maybe heard my voice, that he hated me. Well, perhaps I'll remind him of a father who abandoned him, or a false friend who ripped him off, or turned him in. Dude, I'm not him. Okay? Get over it. Or else you'll waste the next hour needlessly, feeling contempt prior to investigation. Love me in spite of yourself. Now, please forgive me for bringing notes. Dane Bramage. They say that the memory is the second thing to go, but I forget what the first is. I live near Miami, and I moved to Florida in '62 with my family, but I was born in Montreal in 1950. So I'm still a Canadian, but I'm not as comfortable with the cold as I used to be because I'm almost 70. If I can stay alive till May, I'll be 70 years old. Don't hold that against me, but I'm still a kid at heart. I'm just moving a lot slower. You know how that goes. I love asking kids what they want to be when they grow up because I'm still looking for ideas. I've been clean since March 21st of 1985. Which was a new moon and a vernal equinox. And so that was auspicious. And so now I'm an official old fart in recovery. And if I can stay clean till for about another month, I will have 35 years clean. But I work an honest program, so I stand up for 34 at the Clean Time Countdown, even though I have 34 and 11. I was 34 years old and 10 months old when I got clean. So on February 1st of 2020, I celebrated having been clean and in recovery for half of my life, which is not necessarily an accomplishment. If you stay alive long enough, some shit will happen. That's just life. And also if you stick around, which I decided to do. I'm clean thanks to God, to the steps, the NA fellowship, and my own better nature, and my sense of humor. I'm a member of the Enlightenment group of NA in Palmetto Bay, Florida. We have 4 meetings a week, and I always get to at least 1 meeting a week, whether I need to or not, and that way I never need to. I like what the Wizard of Oz said when he was speaking at an H&I meeting. He said, back where I come from, there are addicts who have lots of clean time, and they have no more self-control than you do. But they've got one thing you haven't got. A program. We have a few wizards in NA, Like a journey to Oz, try to let your imagination soar. Imagine a beautiful life full of recovery and joy. Imagination, as Einstein said, knowledge can take you from A to B, but imagination can take you anywhere. Now, I'm a great believer in the sheer force of habit. And I was in the habit of using for 15 years. And ever since, I've been in the habit of recovery. But you don't replace a bad habit with nothing. You have to replace the bad habit of addiction with the good habit of recovery. Never underestimate the sheer force of habit. I'll give you an example. Back in using days, there was times when I decided, you know what, I've used enough this week, and I want to save my money, and I'll wait for the weekend, and I'll drive myself home after work. And sure enough, the car drove itself to the dealer's house. You know how it goes. And as long as I was there, you know what happens. Well, in clean time, there have been times that I decide, you know what, I've been to enough meetings this week, I've had enough recovery, I'm going to drive myself home and get some rest. And sure enough, the car drove itself to the recovery house. And I said, all right, as long as I'm here, I'll go to a meeting. You know how it is. Sheer force of habit, that's what happens automatically without thinking. Well, if we stay clean long enough and practice recovery long enough, we get into the sheer force of habit of recovery. But it doesn't just happen to itself. We have to work a program, we have to want it to happen. I've attended way over 100 NA conventions, and it just so happens that GRCNA 39 is my 39th time as a main speaker. So it's one of those nice coincidences. There was a group in South Miami called Sunset Recovery, and the rule there was start your story with the day you got clean. You'd be amazed how hard it was for some addicts to do that, because they all wanted to tell the ain't it awful war story, That's where everybody wanted to start. But I was taught we all know how to get high, we don't all know how to stay clean. And so the important thing is to start fresh and not get stuck on ancient history. Please try not to compare me to what you're used to. And forgive me for not being a normal speaker, whatever normal is. I have very little story left. I'm too old to remember my story anymore. There's some addicts who think they didn't get their money's worth if a speaker didn't make them cry. Well, that's not my specialty. I'm not skilled at making you cry, but I hope to make you laugh and think. I'm a great believer in humor as part of recovery and the importance of breathing deeply. I've always told my sponsees, remember to keep breathing deeply. They do that in martial arts and in meditation. They say you can't even get started until you learn how to breathe properly. Well, we breathe deeply during deep sleep and exercise, during crying, laughing, but it's a lot more fun to laugh than to cry. Laughter is one of the keys to a happy recovery, and breathing deeply is key to living well. I enjoy laughter like I like swimming, because I'm lazy. In swimming, I can exercise while I'm lying down. And in laughter, I get to breathe deeply while I'm having fun. I suggest to my sponsees that they get a minimum of 3 hours of laughter every week, preferably by watching stand-up comedy or old Warner Brothers cartoons. You know, my hero is Bugs Bunny. While I'm not a professional comedian, I do admit that I have been accused of being funny. I prepare a new and original talk every time I speak. That's to keep it interesting for me. I don't know about you, but it has to be interesting for me or I wouldn't bother. And that's another reason why I need notes. I don't have a rehearsed pitch. I've never given this actual speech before. But my breathing exercises remain roughly the same every time. So here are my 5 minutes of deep breathing exercises. How many addicts does it take to change a light bulb? 2, one to come up with the $10 and the other to promise to be right back with the light bulb. Wait a minute, there's another version. How many addicts does it take to change a light bulb? Only one. He holds the bulb up in the air and waits for the world to revolve around him. Wait, there's another one. How many addicts does it take to change a light bulb? What do you mean, change? So do you know what many addicts these days are using for birth control? Their personalities. What's the difference between an addict and an alcoholic? They'll both steal your wallet, but the addict will help you look for it for half an hour. And what do you say to a crackhead in a 3-piece suit? Will the defendant please rise? And why do crackheads do it doggy style? So they can both peek out the window for the cops at the same time. At the NA dinner dance for H&I, this addict comes up to the microphone and he announces, "I've lost my wallet with $200 in it. Whoever finds it and turns it into me, I'll give a reward of $50. And a voice from the back yells, "I'll give 60." This addict says to God, "God, what's 1,000,000 years to you?" And God says, "A second." The addict says, "God, what's $1,000,000 to you?" God says, "A penny." The addict says, "God, can I have a penny?" God says, "Sure, in a second." This newcomer is looking for the recovery meeting room, and he stops someone who asks, "Excuse me, can you please tell me where the NA meeting is at?" And the old-timer raises his nose and says, "In AA, they taught us never to end a sentence with a preposition." So the newcomer smiles and says, "Okay, excuse me, can you please tell me where the NA meeting is at, asshole?" And lastly, the AA man can't help but notice that the NA man has left the men's room without washing, and he can't resist criticizing. He says, "In AA, they taught us always to wash our hands after we urinate." And the NA man snickers and says, "In NA, they taught us not to urinate on our hands." Thank you all for breathing deeply. Remember, I recommend a minimum of 3 hours a week of deep belly laughs to stay happy and healthy in recovery. Also, I believe in music, but I particularly love soft music like classical and new age music because it produces clarity and tranquility. I enjoy rock and jazz, but they create more chaos and excitement, which I need some of that sometimes. You know, I need to get my heart pumping. But for recovery purposes, I need clarity and I need peace. A little bit about me. Like I said, I don't remember my whole story, but I'll tell you a little about me. at the very first convention I went to, Frick de Four in downtown Miami in the summer of '85, they had a workshop called Keeping Your Memory Green. Well, I had no memory to keep green, but I always remember the topic. It's important for me to remember how it was when I was a brand new newcomer. See, lest I be condemned to repeat it. I was taught we have but a daily reprieve from active addiction. And I also am a great believer in a sufficient bottom. You can't deprive an addict of their sufficient bottom. In some cases, the sufficient bottom is 6 feet under. Sadly, some die. But most of us don't have that moment of clarity until we've had that sufficient bottom. When I had 15 years and 2 months and 9 days clean, that's how long I used. So I went out and I celebrated by going to a meeting. See, I used from January 12, 1970 through March 21st, 1985. 15 years, 2 months, and 9 days. That was enough. Your mileage may vary, and you might have had a shorter career in active addiction or a longer one, and it doesn't matter. We've been taught to relate rather than to compare. I was taught to qualify. How do you qualify as an addict? Well, I had 3 quick bottoms in succession in the fall of '84. First, I set up 3 pipes one night because there was a real good comedy show coming on, and I was so paralyzed that I couldn't laugh. And finally I knew something was wrong. Everybody else knew something was wrong before I did. The second time, same fall, I was using behind 3 locked doors, the front door, the bedroom door, and the bathroom door, because of course every cop in the world was making noise outside my front door. You know how we are. And I was hitting the damn pipe and I paralyzed my diaphragm. And I couldn't breathe, and I was lying on the floor of my bathroom praying, God, please save my life. And he did. And an hour later I was hitting the damn pipe again. And this is how you know I qualify as an addict, that a normal person would say, oh, I better stop doing that, but that shit never stopped us. The third was losing everything. The third bottom. I was being fired from my job, kicked out of my apartment, had my lights turned off, had my phone turned off. None of my friends wanted to know me anymore. I was under the mistaken impression that my life was over at the age of 34. Little did I know. And when I got clean, I thought, well, that's the end of my good times. Little did I know that I would be having a lot more fun in recovery than I'd been having for years in active addiction. I discovered that my active addiction had become the prison of self-centered self-obsession. A lot of us have been locked up just like the guys in the prison, but more important is the prison of the mind. There was this guy I spoke with, a fellow speaker in Cincinnati. He said that he had spent 15 years in 6 city blocks. He could not escape those 6 city blocks. He was so caught up in his addiction that was the only place he felt safe. And finally, he was able to escape that narrow life, that small world, when he finally got clean. That's what I mean by the prison of our self-centered self-obsession. My mother sent me to my first NA meeting. She knew I was in trouble. She had found the drugs, and I hated it. This was in October of '84, and I saw just a bunch of spoiled middle-class kids with their spoiled middle-class problems, and I wanted to go home and get high, and I did. But enough happened in the interim that in January of '85, I finally started going to this meeting called Recovery Group. And I liked the meeting. And I kept going back every Wednesday. And I even stayed clean every Wednesday Just in case anybody said, "Did you get high today?" I could say, "Nope, just for today. I didn't pick up." And I might have heard something those Wednesdays that I could use and that I could keep. I believed those people were staying clean. I believed those people had recovery. I believed them when they told me that they were addicts and that they were now finding a new way of life. I just didn't believe in myself yet. So I did go into treatment, March 21st of 85. And I chose the treatment center with the most NA meetings because I already believed in Narcotics Anonymous. That first day clean, I went into treatment with 2 boxes. One of them was full of vitamins because I was really into it. The other was full of books. And the intake nurse said, your father's going to have to take those 2 boxes home. And I said, why? She said, well, we're going to give you something to read. And they gave me 2 books, the NA Basic Text and, of course, the AA Big Book. And she said, we'll give you vitamins. I said, but I have special vitamins. She says, you don't understand. We don't know what's in all those pills. It hadn't occurred to me that an addict might try to smuggle in a bunch of pills. You know, what a concept. I was really unclear on the concept of treatment. And I thought, well, all right, I'll clean out my system in 4 to 6 weeks and then the drugs will really work. You know, but something happened. I liked staying clean. Instead of passing out and coming to, I started going to sleep and waking up. Some addict said to me my first night there, if you're having trouble sleeping, pray for sleep. So I said, what have I got to lose? And I prayed for sleep, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up the next day. You know, I found out from that God would give me any good thing that I needed for myself if I was willing to ask for it. The problem is that I don't always know what's good for me. That's why I need all of you. See, I like the fact that the cravings subsided fairly quickly. Instead, I just got grumpy. and that subsided too because I decided that I did not want to be pathetic. You know, a lot of us complain and bitch and moan when we're new. And that's just being pathetic. I decided that I wanted to be stronger than that for once. There was a roommate I had in that treatment center. This was a guy named Gil, and he had bought the treatment E's, you know. They hold out 2 baskets and they want to catch you in at least one of them. A and NA. He marched up and down and he said, you're an addict and an alcoholic. And I said, you know, I really don't relate to alcohol that much. I didn't like it very much. I never abused it. He said, oh, you're an addict and an alcoholic. I said, it's just not my thing, and I feel more at home in NA. He said, oh, you're gonna end up using. Well, of course, he used and I didn't. But if there had been a vote in that treatment center, I would have definitely have been voted least likely to recover. See, but almost 35 years later, where are all of them, you know? And I'm still clean. There was another guy. Sometimes people teach you how not to recover. And there was this other guy in my group, in my therapy group, who was all incensed about how people said, you've got to stop using, period. And he said, how dare you how dare you tell me that I can't have a glass of champagne at my daughter's wedding? And he's marching up and down and he's furious, you know. How dare you? And somebody had the presence of mind to ask this guy, how old is your daughter? He said, 2. Right, he was disqualifying himself 20 years in advance for his daughter's potential wedding. And I learned that's what we do. We look for ways that this doesn't apply to us. See. But I made a decision. I made a decision to stick it out and to keep coming back. And that very first night after I left and graduated from that treatment center, Where some people celebrated by going out and using, I instead celebrated by going to a meeting. And I kept that up. That first convention, FRCNA 4, July 4th of 85, there was this guy who shared that he had decided to bet his life on Narcotics Anonymous rather than other fellowships because he didn't need to have his hand shaken, he needed to have his spirit embraced. And this impressed me because I loved the hugs. I related to the hugs. I needed to have my spirit embraced too. I had felt so alone for so long. I had alienated myself from the world and from life and from society. Things changed, and over time, I got involved in service. I became a GSR at 6 months, very important addict. And at a year clean, I got my first one-year medallion, and I was really excited about that. But something wonderful had changed. I had started to care about other people too. And I saw somebody pick up, a couple of months later, I saw somebody pick up their medallion who I had seen pick up their white chip. And I was excited for them as I had been for myself. And that surprised me because I didn't realize that I had grown that much. We see the growth in each other, but we never see it in ourselves. But sometimes we need to remind each other, you've changed, you've grown, you've become better. I went on through service. I became the area lit chair and the vice chair, and I was in 1990. I was the area chair, the chair of the ASC, and they browbeat me so much that from then on, I decided to only aspire to the highest level of service, which is group secretary. And of course, I also sponsor and speak and write. But the important thing is on the group level, service on the group level, because that's where recovery really happens. Sometimes the area and regional and world service is there to keep very important addicts busy and out of the politics of my home group. That's a valuable service that they perform. I've had experiences, like everybody else. I had a business, and in 2001, unfortunately, it failed. I've had illnesses. In 2007, I had dizziness and high blood pressure and atrial fibrillation. And then they discovered I had prostate cancer, and I had 40 radiation treatments for that, and now I glow in the dark. And I also was treated for aortic stenosis, and I had to have open heart surgery for that. And while I was in the hospital for 18 days, at first they wanted to give me all these strong painkillers. They wouldn't even give me the surgery unless I agreed to the painkillers. And I said, all right, I admit that I don't want to go into shock. But after I came to, I asked them for only half as much as they wanted to give me, half as often as they wanted to give it to me. And within 3 days, I asked them to stop. Because I respect drugs enough that I don't want to lose my clean time or my recovery. At the same time, I brought my computer with me, and I went to online meetings while I was in there for surgery. And I brought my basic text, and I brought my phone, and I stayed in touch with my recovery. Even so, I was cranky for a couple of days, as we do. But I got over it. On the other hand, I wouldn't agree to do any service for the first 6 months after that. Because I believe that even though we don't lose our clean time for necessary medication under surgery, we may lose our presence of mind, even if briefly. The same thing happened with my mother. My mom had breast cancer for 20 years, and at her bottom, she had never been a drug addict. But at the end, she was thinking only of the next dose. She was obsessed with the next drug. And she had never been a drug addict. This gave me enormous respect for the power of drugs, even for somebody who had never been an addict. Stuff happens. I also have chronic kidney disease, stage 4. And I take good care of myself so it doesn't progress. And, if you live long enough, some shit will happen. I'd hate to be 120, be dying of nothing. So it's okay. I'm not complaining. At her bottom, the rest of the family was walking on eggshells. They didn't know how to deal with my mother's impending death. But I had come close to death myself, and I could talk to her about spirituality and about death. And she said to me, grabbed my hand, and she said to me, "You're my hero." I didn't feel much like a hero, but geez, sometimes it doesn't take much to give people comfort and to be there for somebody who needs us, even in the darkest of times. As for our theme at this convention, one fellowship, one family, I agree with Groucho Marx, who said, "I would never belong to a club that would have a person like me for a member." Well, that's my story. Is I've ended up in NA. It's an association of antisocial criminals who happen to save lives. We're rather amazing. I've experienced that coming to believe leads to coming to belong. And gradually I came to feel like a member here. But we're not all the same. Some members' families were seriously dysfunctional, and some families rejected them, and some families were sick themselves and died young. And for a lot of addicts, we are the substitute family that gives them the first sense of belonging that they've had in a long while. And in some cases, the first sense of belonging they've had in their lives. Some members never even had good parental role models. Sometimes they find that in NA. One sponsor once told me that I was the closest thing he had had in his life to a good father. That touched me. In NA, I have family everywhere. Whenever I travel, one of the first things I do is to find the NA meetings. Actually, I look them up even before I leave, because now you can do it online. I participate in the meetings, even though it's all strangers. I get hugs, and I feel at home anywhere. I've experienced this young in recovery when I traveled to Denver in '88. And they had a weird procedure there. They had a treasurer's report at the very beginning of the meeting, because their theory was that it's every member's right to know where the money went. See, and at first I said, well, this is weird. And then I realized they have every right to do it their way. And actually, that it was maybe a good idea, and it was interesting. And I didn't have to feel alienated that in different places we do it different ways. It's actually a good thing. Every town has their own methods and habits, and it helps us to practice tolerance and acceptance when we don't get bent out of shape over it. After all, our informality is our strength, not a weakness. There are only 2 rituals that we have in NA, which is the opening readings and the closing circle. And there's only 1 ceremony, which is the chips and medallions. Otherwise, it's all informal. There's a bad habit that I've seen in some NA meetings, where some newcomer will hold up his hand and start sharing right away, and somebody will yell out, "What's your name?" Well, I was taught this is Narcotics Anonymous, not Narcotics, what's your name? It upsets those newcomers, and sometimes they lose their place. Humming. They forgot what they were going to say. We don't have to interrupt or shame people just because they don't know our customs. It's only a custom. It's not an NA commandment. We learn to be part of rather than apart from. And over time, we learn the lingo of NA. And it's a worldwide fellowship with many perks, friends everywhere, if we're willing to make friends. Now, I tend to be a loner, I tend to be an isolator, I tend to be an introvert, but I've managed to get outside of myself. And I've learned that we addicts need to do the opposite of what we think we want to do. An addict who wants to be alone all the time has to learn how to reach out and be with people. And an addict who's a social butterfly and wants to be with people all the time has to learn how to be comfortable by themselves. See, an addict needs to learn how to do the opposite of what he thinks he wants to do. We also know that we're not a cult, because in cults, people are made to dress alike and think alike and pledge loyalty to an exalted teacher. In NA, we not only don't think alike, but our differences of thinking seem to get more pronounced over time. But we have much more in common than we have differences. And the longer we're clean, the more we accept and love each other despite our differences. We share not just a problem, which is the disease of addiction, but a goal, which is to stay clean and to recover and to become responsible and productive and to enjoy an awakening of the spirit. We seek to lead a balanced life and to be happy, joyous, and free. And by balance, I mean, finding the happy medium, give and take. Some addicts only know how to take. They'll drain you dry, and they need to learn how to give. And some addicts only know how to give. They figure they can only justify their existence by always giving, and they don't know how to take. And they have to learn give and take. And light and dark. And by dark, I don't mean evil. Please don't do anything evil. Thank you very much. But I mean by dark, sadness, anger. It's okay to be sad, and it's okay to be pissed off at injustice. It's okay to say ouch when someone wrongs you rather than to just cower. That's light and dark. It's okay to be happy, it's okay to be sad. As long as we don't get stuck. See, work and play. Active and restful. Balance is one of the key goals in my recovery. And I try to practice that. Because you know how we get. I could get so stuck on something. I try to play what I call the 2-hour rule, which is don't do anything longer than 2 hours. Even if it feels really good, don't do it for longer than 2 hours. Even the stuff you love, eating, laughing, sex, it doesn't matter what, you could end up rubbing yourself the wrong way. I don't know, but even the good things, get up and do something else after 2 hours. Even if you just have to go pee, which at my age I have to do even sometimes shorter than 2 hours. So that's one way to wake me up. We don't single out our black sheep because we were all black sheep. And everyone in NA serves a useful purpose. Some serve the useful purpose of being a bad example. There was a row of old timers in the back of a big meeting I used to go to, and they would hoot and holler and make fun. They would laugh at the people who were sharing, and they would walk in and out. They would go out for a smoke, and I asked my sponsor, what's with these guys? He said, well, they're here to show you how not to recover. I ended up sitting in the front row almost all the time after that, where I wouldn't be distracted by the antics of the guys in the back row. The peanut gallery, I used to call them. And of course, I love newcomers, and it's the newcomer's job to be crazy. I was, weren't you? We were all crazy as newcomers. But while I love the newcomer, I don't ask him to hold my wallet while I go swimming. Not fair to me, not fair to him. Every now and then a newcomer comes in the rooms and wants to argue with us that this is all bullshit. And a competent chairperson should interrupt and explain that this is a recovery meeting, not a debate, and we'll be happy to get together for his pet discussion after the meeting. That's because it's not fair to the rest of us to let one naysayer hold the whole group hostage when we all came here to recover. See. Now, there's 4 simple truths that we hold as self-evident in Narcotics Anonymous. These are not up for dispute. 1, addiction is a disease. 2, alcohol is a drug. 3, the NA steps and traditions are our program of recovery. You know, you can find something else if you want, but in NA, our steps and traditions are our program. And 4, NA works. These 4 facts are not up for dispute because they prove themselves in the lives of addicts every day. The only completely wrong way to work the steps is to not work them at all. There's as many ways to work the steps as there are sponsors. The steps are just a blueprint. They show us how to build an edifice of recovery. And while we should not subtract from the steps, lest that edifice be unstable, there's nothing to prevent us from adding to them to make our recovery more complete and more comprehensive. There was this guy, Billy, who used to say, never limit what the steps and traditions could do in your life. That stayed with me for the last 30-something years. We learn to get right with ourselves, with others, with God, and with life. And in the process, we were restored to innocence. And by that, I don't mean ignorance. I mean not guilty, you know. We stop doing shitty things to each other. And we get restored to sweetness. I had a sponsee who kept having trouble in relationships, and it was because he kept looking for sexy or smart or a peer or rich or something like that. And I said, have you been looking for sweetness? And his jaw dropped because he didn't realize that this was the key ingredient that he hadn't been looking for. And from then on, he had had better and better relationships. The recovery and company of other clean addicts gives us hope. Each one of us is the message of recovery. We never know when we might have to stand up and be that message. Also, recovery is not a competition. The more recovery you have, the better company it is for my recovery. See, if you're doing well, my recovery will prosper as well. My home group in Palmetto Bay has 5 regular members with over 34 years clean. And in spite of me closing in on 35, I have the 3rd most clean time in the group. And it's not a very big group. But because I feel reasonably secure in my recovery, and not as though I have to compete, I'm glad whenever somebody in the room has more clean time than me. See, I don't feel irritated that somebody else has more time. NA is a proven successful recovery fellowship with long-term recovery. We are no one else's little brother anymore. See, I'm a great believer in the power of encouragement. That's what our one family and one program tells us. We encourage each other, and never underestimate the power of encouragement. It means lending courage to each other. See, just like youngsters and soldiers encourage each other to be brave, well, we encourage each other to face reality. We encourage each other to recover. It's important not to glorify the disease of addiction. You know, sometimes you'll see people telling war stories and say, you think that's sick, wait till you hear this, as though it's a competition to out-sick each other. I don't think we should glorify our disease. It's important to emphasize the positive. These are the gifts of recovery. Yes, there are responsibilities that come with it, and that's one of the things we accept along the way. It's important not to use "I'm an addict" as your go-to excuse, Well, what do you expect? I'm only an addict, as though somehow that excuses bad behavior or sick thinking. Well, that's old behavior, and we need to get over it. It's also important to avoid dogmatic ideology. Whenever ideology is more important than humanity, real people suffer. If you love your home in NA, do what you can to make it a better place. And don't always leave it to somebody else to do the work to keep it alive. But turn it over. In the spirit of rotation of service, don't try to keep doing everything all by yourself. This leads to burnout. That happened to me with a group that I started, and I had to turn the key in because nobody had the willingness to. I was the chief cook and bottle washer. I was doing everything. And nobody would step up and say, okay, I'll take over. So I had to turn in the key. I had other responsibilities. If you feel like NA is not your home, do what it takes to make it your home. And if you don't love NA, change what resentments or misgivings you have that prevent that love. NA is not the only way that addicts have ever recovered. We talk about medicine, religion, and psychiatry. There's nothing inherently wrong with medicine, religion, and psychiatry. It's just that they're not sufficient for us. Each of them, or even all three of them together, are not a complete program of recovery from addiction. That's what NA does. See, NA is the easiest path for. This is the easier, softer way, because it's tailor-made for addicts. It fits us like a glove. Here's why we recover together: encouragement, good company, good examples, bad examples, shared insight into similar problems, and what I like to call anonymous revelation. By this I mean, there have been times that I've come to a meeting with a problem and didn't have the courage to share what was going on. But somebody else held up their hand and shared the exact same thing, and other people shared the solution, and I didn't even have to raise my hand. That's the anonymous revelation. It happens every day. See. We also have to pull our diseases pants down in sympathetic company. I don't believe in pulling each other's pants down. That's just being cruel. But sometimes we need to expose our own sick thinking and run it past other people. Also, in the spirit of one fellowship, I do not divide my loyalty. I'm not morally opposed to AA, I just don't go there. See, I wish them well. They are a proven program of recovery, but I've bet my life on Narcotics Anonymous. Now, just a few thoughts about recovery and about spirituality. One of the sayings of Albert Einstein has helped guide my recovery. He said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. See, that's why we have to grow. That's why we have to expand our spirits and our spiritual awakening and our spiritual awareness. Because from the perspective of a using addict, there is no escape. A major aspect of the disease of addiction is the self-destructive impulse. We find ways to hurt ourselves, even besides getting high. Looking for trouble, stirring the shit pot. Things are going great. How can I screw this up? This is the self-destructive impulse that we need to be alert to. There's nobody in the world more miserable, I was taught, and desperate than an addict with no recovery and no dope. At least the dope was a solace to some of us. But, you hear about addicts who went out and they already know too much, and they told me NA spoils your high. You know, they already knew too much. And here's what's crazy. The kind of distorted thinking of an addict. An addict is the only person in the world who can look down on you while he's lying flat on his back in the gutter. This is the intersection of grandiosity with low self-esteem, of egomania with degradation, you know. And the funny thing is, most of us have been there. You know, judging other people even while our lives are falling apart. I have said before, you cannot deprive an addict of a sufficient bottom. Sometimes we just have to hit enough of a bottom that we'll say, I'll do anything. Stop using? Oh no, not that. You know, that's not a sufficient bottom then. I needed to be convinced that only by stopping using would I survive. You take the drugs out of a drug addict and you still have an addict.
Yeah, right.
The problem is addiction, intoxication, pursuit of a rush. It's not a substance per se that ever wrestled me to the ground, you know, and forced itself up my nose or down my throat. It's the glue between my ears that made me do that. It's the sick thinking that made me think that getting high was a solution to my problems to begin with. And in clean time, I've seen addicts go out over other intoxications. Could be gambling, could be sex addiction, could be romance addiction, which is even worse. Because, you know, with sex addiction, eventually you're satisfied, at least temporarily. But with romance addiction, you always want to be falling backwards off the high dive board of love. You know, that could be a sickness all in itself. And sometimes it can never be satisfied. I've learned that we're not here for being stupid, we're here for being crazy. My first sponsor went through that with his sponsor, where he said, I couldn't believe I was so stupid. He said, well, are you a dope? Are you an unintelligent person? He said, no, I'm pretty smart, actually. He said, then try to understand that what makes an addict do stupid things is not stupidity, it's insanity. And from this I've learned that while some are sicker than others, some are sicker than everybody. And but it's not for me to judge. You know, one of the things that happens is we get paper carriers. You know, people who come into our meetings holding a piece of paper saying, "Sign my damn paper and let me get out of here." Well, if I judged them, I wouldn't give them the chance to survive in recovery. Some of those paper carriers have become some of our best members. See, you never know who's going to really get this and who's going to want recovery bad enough. I've learned, do not glorify the disease, do not bargain with the disease, do not coddle, pander, or cater to the disease. Addiction is the enemy. I have to take it that seriously. I've also learned, thank God, that life isn't fair. If it were, we'd never stop paying for all the shit we've pulled. I've also learned that it's easier to stay clean than to get clean. And that I can find peace anywhere. There was this spiritual teacher named Ram Dass. He started something in the prisons called the Ashram Project. And his idea was that you can learn to meditate and treat even incarceration as a spiritual opportunity. See, some people get pissed off at coming to meetings and say, do I really have to keep coming to these damn meetings? This is a spiritual opportunity. I'm a lucky guy. See, it's all in my perspective. Clean means much more than just not using. It also means not dirty. One of the things that passed through my head when I was new was maybe I could do penny ante dealing again, and this time I won't be my own best customer. Well, no, because I would have to sample the merchandise and see if it was good, and my customers wouldn't trust me if they thought I couldn't use it. And even worse, if it's poison for me, it's poison for you. And what right do I have to poison somebody else? See. So I learned to not live dirty. Even got superstitious about never lying or cheating or stealing. You know, superstition like step on a crack, break your mother's back, something like that. I was afraid when I was a newcomer that if I lied, I could ruin my program. So I learned either not to lie or not to talk so much. Because sometimes you don't have to lie, you just have to, what's the saying, never miss a good chance to shut up? Well, that became an important lesson as well. I've learned, be kind to the newcomer. You never know when you may have to ask him to be your sponsor. I've seen it and I've seen it. I've learned that addiction is multidimensional. It's physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. So must my recovery also be multidimensional. What I love about NA conventions, I call it the University of NA. Coming to NA conventions is like a higher education, where I get to hear the message from all over, where I get to hear things I don't hear in my home group. It's like a ferment, it's like a cross-pollination of different ideas in recovery. That's one of the reasons we celebrate recovery, but we also share innovations. And you can have good new ideas in recovery. I have had sayings that I came up with come back to me, and I didn't have to say, oh, I said that, because it's an anonymous program. But I felt good to know that something I said had made a circuit and come back to me, The desire to stop using in our third tradition has to flip at some critical point into the desire to stay clean. So the desire to stop using is like pushing yourself away from something negative, but the desire to stay clean is like pulling yourself towards something positive. I've also learned we need to shift the desire to feel good into the desire to be happy. Feeling good is great, but it's not a sufficient motivation. But happiness, joy, and freedom, those are sufficient motivations to stick with this. Feeling good can be taken away from you, but the attitude of happiness, joy, and freedom cannot. Cheerfulness is a choice. I choose to be cheerful. I choose to be happy. Attitude isn't everything. It's only 90%. I've also learned, why would you join a 12-step fellowship and not work the 12 steps? There's plenty of addicts who pick a sponsor in name only, who will not make them work steps because they hadn't worked them themselves. We look for a shortcut, but there isn't a shortcut to recovery. There may be a shortcut to actual work, but not to recovery. I've also learned the value of force yourself. There's been times I didn't want to go to a meeting, I forced myself. Didn't want to do service, I forced myself. Didn't want to make the meeting on time, and I forced myself. I'm reminded of the story of the rich lady in the park who's walking her dog, and a bum comes up to her and says, "Lady, I haven't eaten in 3 days." And she says, "Oh, well, you should force yourself." She's clearly unclear on the concept of hunger. But sometimes that's what we have to do, is force ourselves. Even when we don't want to recover, sometimes that's what we need to do. My third sponsor was a guy named Greg P. from Tennessee, and he used to say this is a get to, not a got to program. And he said there were sergeants in NA who will waggle their finger at you and say, you got to do this and you got to do that and you got to work steps and you got to get a sponsor. You got to go to me. He said, no, you don't. You don't have to do any of that stuff as long as you can stand it. He said, but if you're lucky, you'll get to go to good meetings. You'll get to have a wonderful sponsor. And you'll get to work steps. And you'll get to recover. It's a get to, not a got to program. We don't have to force anybody else to recover. We don't have to insist. We just have to set a good example. I've learned that there is no safe obsession, compulsion, or addiction for an addict. You know, oh, that addiction is bad, but this one's okay. No, anything will set me off. My first sponsor went out over gambling and resentment, I have to admit. You know, he had been betrayed on the floor of area and fired his sponsor the same day and never came back. Started missing meetings. Ended up going to the casino instead of to meetings. Moved away, didn't hear from him. And when he should have had 10 years clean, he said, oh, the best things happened to me is I started using again. And of course, he ended up dying. You know, he would have had 2.5 years more than me now if he hadn't let resentment and other forms of addiction get to him. And he was a wonderful guy, very spiritual. Everybody admired him. The ABCs of recovery. For an active addict, the ABCs are always be cool. Hey man, I'm cool. But for a newcomer, the ABCs are always be clean. You know, don't pick up no matter what. For somebody with a little more time, the ABCs are always be coming back. You know, don't lose interest. Don't stop returning. And for those of us with a little more time, the ABCs are always be conscious. See, drugs alter consciousness, but recovery raises consciousness. And the difference is that when you raise consciousness, you don't have to come down again. You know, that doesn't mean we can't, because we can work the steps backwards. We can stop practicing principles in all our affairs. We can stop seeking to know God's will for us and the power to carry it out. We can stop admitting when we're wrong. You know, we can stop being willing to make amends when we do wrong. And this is a whole process of reversing. And I've seen addicts who people admired in their recovery end up losing interest and becoming caught up in their addiction all over again and end up going out. It can happen. Like I said, attitude isn't everything. It's only 90%. We talk about the only thing that will defeat us in our recovery is an attitude of indifference or intolerance towards spiritual principles. And that's the very definition of a bad attitude. See, I can't afford the luxury of a bad attitude. And I have to check my attitude. There are two things that I'm never powerless over: my actions and my attitude. It is up to me to direct my attitude rather than to just let circumstances create my attitude. And of course, if you have a choice between being right and being happy, always choose happy.
That's right.
I was so right it could have killed me, you know. And what was important was to walk away from the argument and just be happy. Balance is that point of poise where my various desires are not in conflict with each other. See, I want a lot of stuff, and it's okay to desire. It's okay to have right desire. But it's important that my desires not be in conflict. They need to be in balance. The goal of recovery is balance and moderation means a little of everything with nothing too much, with the single exception of intoxicating chemicals, because I've already used enough of those for 2 lifetimes. See. Okay, little time left. A large portion of recovery is just growing up. And we suffer from immaturity and insecurity. And we need to become adults. Some of us are stuck at the point where we started using. You know, you see them, they started using at age 14, and you'll see them at the NA dances, newcomers, and they'll say, what if I ask her to dance? And she says no. Like, that'll be the end of the world. You know, we develop a thicker skin over time. We stop letting little things get to us quite as badly. We're evolving. We're a work in progress, as long as we allow ourselves to be. There was a ceramic plaque that I got my mother, and she hung it in her kitchen, and it said, "Be patient, God is not finished with me yet." I was taught that there's an eightfold path of recovery. Meetings, steps, sponsorship, fellowship, reading and writing, prayer and meditation, service, and the 8,000-pound telephone. And I did all 7 of those except for the telephone. You know, I called my sponsor, but I didn't call everybody else. But basically, I really believed in having a robust program. And as a consequence, you know, I managed to stay clean. You could just stay clean on just meetings, but you'll only have a fraction of the program you could have, of the joy of recovery that you could have. There is a spiritual awakening in every step, and there's a surrender in every step. And there's also no magic wand. You know, addicts want a magic wand of recovery, as though, you know, by sitting close to my sponsor, I'll get recovery by contagion or by infection, you know. And it just doesn't happen. It doesn't work. Enthusiasm, yes. There's an infection of enthusiasm, but not of recovery. You can borrow my higher power, but you're going to have to give it back and get your own. You can borrow my recovery, but you're going to have to give it back and get your own. We each have to create our own program of recovery, not from scratch. We can borrow, take bits and pieces from everywhere, and learn. But we have to make the program our own. We have to strive to be even better than the examples we've been given. A really good sponsor would like nothing better than to have a sponsee who exceeds and surpasses them in recovery and in other blessings. And just because others fall short doesn't mean that we have to.
Amen.
Don't let others' failures or shortcomings hold you back. There's an old saying, your bad behavior is no justification for my bad behavior.
Amen.
And speaking of bad behavior, there are members with as much time as me, but of whom I don't want what they have. You know, one of them is back pounders. You know, they'll give you a hug, but they'll pound your back so much they'll bruise you. You know. And then there's the you're wrongers, the ones who will wait until everybody has shared, and then at the end of the meeting they'll share why everybody was wrong.
Just want to be heard.
Then there's the very important addicts, you know. And there's the schemers, somebody who's always got an angle, you know. But even so, we can't always spot the phonies. We think we can, because we think it takes one to know one. But we addicts are really the best actors in the world. I don't know if you've noticed. There's a saying in Hollywood, the most important thing in this town is sincerity. Once you got that faked, you got it made. You know, and eventually, sincerity and authenticity prove themselves by what we do, not by what we say. Forgiveness is powerful. And never underestimate the power of forgiveness. To forgive others who may have hurt us takes away their power to control how we feel. We forgive them not because they deserve our forgiveness, but because we deserve peace. Some addicts mistakenly say, God did everything, I didn't do nothing. But he at least had your cooperation. I thank God that this is a spiritual, not a religious program. Addicts don't have to die for failing to believe the same way that you do. Don't tell me what you believe. Tell me what you're willing to do to help another addict. there's a saying we have in our basic text, if a solution isn't practical, then it's not spiritual. And that applies to faith matters equally. Practical spirituality means if there's a heaven, who do you think is there? Those who had perfected their belief system, or those who gave their fellow creatures compassion, kindness, forgiveness, respect, and love? That's what's important. Spiritual is as spiritual does. I heard it said in the rooms, religion is for those who are afraid of hell, and spirituality is for those who have already been there. Greg also used to say, if you want to find NA, go to hell and make a left. See, addicts taught me, life doesn't get better, I get better. Life is still just life, but I recover. There's a saying, before you know it, it'll all be over. And that's okay. It's okay that things don't last forever. It's okay that someday I'll die. It's okay that a convention comes to an end. It's okay that a meeting comes to an end. Sometimes it's even okay that a friendship comes to an end, even though it makes us sad. You know, some friendships are just for a season. But even in spite of everything, I learned that a grateful addict doesn't use, and a humble addict doesn't use, and an addict working the steps doesn't use, and an addict committed to service doesn't use, and an addict who stays in the middle doesn't fall off the edge, and that those who keep coming to our meetings regularly stay clean. So if I want to stay clean, I'll stay grateful, stay humble, keep working the steps, stay committed to service, stay in the middle, and keep coming back. And I'll bet you that I'll stay clean. You know, it's really easy. If I've told you too much and your head hurts and you can't remember all this, you don't have to. You can download the recording. It's all right. I always like to close with a prayer. And for the next year at least, may God always be with you. May no harm befall you. And may no harm befall anyone else because of you. May light and love always surround you and fill you. May you find joy, peace, and welcome wherever you go. May goodness and mercy always follow you, and may a good reputation always precede you. May the disorder and confusion of the world around you fail to rob you of your self-worth and peace of mind. And may all the wishes of your higher power come true. God bless and be well, and thank you very much for letting me share.